Welcome to the Perspective Knoll, a channel that creates audiobooks from original stories and including some fan fiction short stories in between. If this is something you're into, then feel free to like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of our new content.
Chapter 27. Changes for the Western Kingdom. Over the next few hours, Charles was held over at the inn, named the Firestarter, which was just a few blocks away from the castle itself. He wasn't a prisoner by any means, and yet there was a fear of uncertainty that hung in the air. Everywhere he looked there were Severland mages and their hounds patrolling the streets. Chrono and Marla were hauled back to the courtyard in front of the castle for questioning. Surely all the fairies were being questioned, and Karen the fairy caretaker as well. Charles was downstairs, pacing the floor and thinking about what could possibly happen next when the door opened, and a mage came in. It was a woman with blonde hair, and she wore white robes, and behind her came a familiar face. It was none other than Shawn Harken. Charles rushed over to greet him with a crushing hug. "I can't believe you're here too," said Shawn as they released their hold on one another. Before Charles could say another word, Laurie and Anthony walked in the front door and he hugged them as well. Charles was a little bummed when he realized that Harmon was not with them. The mage who led them in left shortly after the hugs were over with. They all took a seat around the hearth that was across from the front desk and began filling each other in on what had happened since they all got separated. "I have learned the ways of magic, well, what they are calling here a druid," said Shawn with a proud smile. Jolene had need of a spell slinger of sorts. She hadn't tried using anyone through the paintings. When she had heard that Charles and I had come through, she needed one of us. It was strange at first, I wasn't showing any signs of having powers, but something pushed through. I think it was the need to have those abilities that she was looking for. If not, she was going to make me a member of the Stormbreaker Owls. But I managed to pass her test to give her comfort to set her plans in motion. Though I'm no pro, not just yet, but it's been an incredible journey. Do you know they have vampires here? What? Get out of here, Charles rolled his eyes. Oh yeah, vampires. Wings and all. Shawn had then rubbed his hands together and was excited to tell them about his personal experience with one. Over in the town of Orchanda just down the road to the west of here, a Severland mage named Sarah was with me at the time to confirm my story. In fact, she was the one who escorted us here to the inn. Anyways, we ran into a vampire named Fremdel in the Orchanda mines. Laurie was excited to hear about vampires and even more still to know if all of the myths were true. How was that experience? Did he try to kill you? Suck your blood, she had asked while practically sitting on the edge of her chair. Oh no, we actually watched him come back to life and then he helped us free Leo Mandarin. Shawn was feeling proud of himself and all that he had accomplished and seen in the short amount of time that he had been there, and wondered if the others could top his story. "The Leo Mandarin?" asked Anthony, and Shawn, very matter of fact, nodded his head. "Wow. Well, I was able to get Harmon away from those soldiers. Turns out when I got over to where they were keeping him, Captain Brennan was threatening to shoot Harmon with your crossbow, Charles. So, I ripped through a few guards before I tore the captain in half." "That's horrific," Laurie winced. Anthony sat back in his chair and shrugged at her comment. "But effective." From there, Harmon and I dealt with the remaining guards and took shelter in a nearby home. Once all the strange lightning began to shoot all over the place and the screaming that was coming from the courtyard, we figured it was best to lay low. "So, I hear you have a talent too, Laurie." Laurie blushed and for a moment, felt embarrassed and excited all at once. "Well, it turns out that when I went through the portrait, I gained an ability. Well, just like the rest of you. Apparently, I'm what they call a necromancer. I can take life through magic and have the ability to resurrect someone by using the life essence of someone I have recently killed." "That's insane, what a ridiculous ability," Charles almost laughed at such an absurd gift. "Wait, so how do you know that's how your abilities work?" Shawn had put a hand in the air and gave it a wave so to get Charles' attention. "She used that little trick on me." "On you? What happened to you?" Did you die? Charles was only joking, and he laughed at the thought. Yeah, Shawn was serious with his response. What? Charles' expression went from smiling to jaw-dropping in a fraction of a second. Yeah, I guess a stone got knocked loose from the castle and struck me on the side of the head. Laurie killed a handful of mages, and with their life essence she was able to bring me back. Charles shook his head in disbelief. Okay, I'm just going to take your word on that because I don't want to have to die and then have you, Laurie, attempt to bring me back in order for you to prove what you can do. Charles leaned back in his chair and the others laughed. A woman had come by and gave them all glasses of water and asked them if they wanted anything from the kitchen. None of them wanted any food, however. Shawn, Laurie, and Anthony had asked for the best ale they had. The woman smiled and asked Charles if he wanted some as well, which he respectfully declined. So, Charles, what sort of weirdness did you encounter? Asked Shawn. Well, Harmon followed me around everywhere I went. I met this spirit named Dale Shepherd. Apparently, he was a lawman like myself. That's the ability I got while I was here and in the town of Jordan's Post. I was able to track down a stolen baby that was taken to be sacrificed for one of the old gods called Errol. I've heard that name before, Shawn said, thinking back. Yeah, in a book I was reading at Jolene's. It was a book by Trouvenel. She is like a scribe of sorts. She kept documentation over the 5, meaning the 5 original gods of Lufforain, and it talked about Errol, and basically, he wasn't a nice guy or god. Sorry for the sidetrack there, Charles. So what kind of abilities does a lawman have? I can see events that have happened in the past. Charles began to explain. For example, when I was tracking the baby who was abducted. If I was to focus enough on what might have happened, say in a room for example, then a gold, like dust would materialize into people or objects that aren't there anymore. It's crazy really. It would morph into a 3D scene and I could watch what had happened. Hell, I can even pause the scene and get a 360 view of it all. Anthony had leaned forward and asked, but you can hear them speak, right? I mean, back at my parents' house you claimed you heard muffled voices coming from the images. That's right, I did, answered Charles. I don't know if the voices ever come in clear, but if they do, I won't need to eavesdrop on anyone ever. Simply wait until they leave an area they had just been talking and stand in the same spot and wait for the gold dust to share the details. Laurie had sat back and was astounded by all the stories. There is something I have noticed though. She paused for a moment as she gathered her thoughts. Through all our adventures, the first time our abilities had surfaced, they were exactly what we needed. Charles, you are a detective, and the lawman skill is what suited you best and the task at hand. Shawn, you needed to be a spellcaster or druid, and so you were able to manifest it for Jolene. I myself had seen you die hours ago and I wasn't about to start thinking about life without you, so again, the skill I needed surfaced. Anthony had thought on her words and Shawn and Charles seemed to be agreeing with her as well. The woman came back with their drinks. It wasn't long after they had begun drinking that the door of the inn opened once more, and there was another Severlan mage who had entered. He walked up to the man at the front desk and slid him a piece of paper and then turned to the group. He stepped forward and looked at them all before saying anything. Good evening, guest. My name is Warenth and I have come to collect you and bring you all before the Archmage. So, if you'd please, follow me. They didn't have a choice, but there was nothing threatening about Warenth and it intrigued them all to find out who this Archmage was. There was a fear of the unknown that slowly began to build within them all. They walked back out into the streets and headed to the courtyard in front of the castle. The courtyard was now in view and the first thing that stood out was a single painting that was sitting on a stand and facing away from them. There were 3 people off to the right of it. One was Sarah Severlan, still in her white robes, and there was Leo Mandarin next to the painting. He looked much better as he now had been cleaned up and shaved. There was also an older man who was standing to the left of Sarah, and Shawn had guessed that he was the Archmage. Sir, I present to you the people from Earth. Warenth then backed away a few steps. I am Archmage Rylan Wormist. I am one of the 12 heads that control the happenings within and outside of Severlan Tower. The man didn't seem too old and had only a short, white stubble goatee. Other than that, he had no hair on the rest of his face. He was also bald, and it was a bit out of the ordinary to see someone without eyebrows. I'm sure you're all wanting to go back to your home? Yes, please. Charles was the first one to speak out. Look, I think it was purely an accident that we came here in the first place. I apologize. For what? The Archmage asked. For coming through the painting and traveling freely about your world, answered Charles. Well, we were following a murder case back home, Shawn stated in hopes to better explain what Charles may have been apologizing for. We went to go see this older lady and sure enough, a fairy was there. She was the one who showed us the painting and then next thing we knew, we were here. The old mage seemed to be processing what he just heard. You were doing your job, Charles, a voice said from behind them. They all turned, and it was a tall thin blue elf. He wore simple-looking clothes and sandals on his feet. His white hair was in a ponytail and his eyes were almost black. Good evening. I am Prince Insamal of the Gorferndain Elves. Should we bow? Asked Laurie as she wanted to respectable as possible to their guest of royalty. No need, my lady, Insamal answered. Rylan, these people were destined to come here. I have seen things in my travels. Before we began to march on the Western Kingdom. Things that I have found to be most unsettling. Is this a conversation we should have now? Asked Rylan. Or can it wait? Insamal tilted his head slightly and nodded. It can wait, Rylan. Good. Now then you four, Rylan folded his hands in front of himself and stood up straight. You have the right to know what has happened here. Queen Memphia is missing. She is at this point, wanted by Sevelin Tower. She has gathered up as many of Leo Mandarin paintings as she could in attempts to claim another world by force. There is no forgiveness for such an act. King Uriel is guilty of the same crime. However, we have him in our custody and is going to be sent to the island, a prison that. Well, let's just say it's for beings like him. The paintings are not to be destroyed, for they are a marvel from our history. But they are also not to be used. Rylan paused as if going through a mental checklist of things he was willing to tell them. Ah yes, Jolene Hamlin will also be joining him on the island. She has practiced necromancy countless times, which is illegal in all corners of Lufforain. And her thirst for power won't stop here. She is very dangerous. Even those owls that she had called her own, were scared off once my mages began pouring through the portal. The Western Kingdom from this moment is now the property of Sevelin, continued Rylan. That is until we can make sure that history will not repeat itself. The guards must all be changed out and a new ruler appointed, but until that time, we will make sure it rebuilds the right way. Shawn could feel his stomach beginning to turn. Wait, what about the wolf? The one that was with Jolene, he asked. It was strange that he had grown attached to Dremmer and Jolene and considered them friends. He didn't like the fact that Jolene was being sent to prison, but Dremmer shouldn't be allowed the same fate. The wolf, why do you ask? Rylan was suspicious and searched Shawn over to see what intentions he had or may be hiding. Shawn looked at Laurie and thought for a moment. Then he turned back to the Archmage. I believe he doesn't deserve a prison, at least not out there. My dear boy, he does. Let me tell you why. He followed Jolene like a loyal dog. He helped kill many innocent people. He helped protect her while she was taking the bodies of the children from the towns. He killed many guards here so that she could have her battle. Rylan cleared his throat. He has been healed if that comforts you, and is going to the island, with Jolene and Uriel. Now, the real reason why you're here. This is the painting that you came here by, is it not? Rylan had stepped back and pointed at the painting on the stand. Shawn did a double take and realized that the painting showed his living room. He turned to Laurie and then to Charles. Why does that look like the inside of our house? Charles hesitated before he answered. We thought if Argatha was going to go through the painting again that she would at least be turned around once she got back into our world, but I wanted to go too, said Laurie as Charles was fumbling over his own words. Charles brought it to our house with Anthony and suddenly Harmon came through the painting and was in our kitchen, raiding the pantry. I wanted to see you. Make sure you were okay and sitting in our house knowing that the rest of you were here, trying to get you back. Shawn, I would have gone crazy. May I continue? Rylan asked with a hint of irritation. The four looked straight at the mage and made sure not to interrupt him again. This painting shows the inside of your home. I will tell you that once back on the other side that you have to take this painting down. Hide it somewhere and do not hang it up to be used again. Is this understood? All four of them said yes in unison. Good, now I will let you say your goodbyes and then you must go. Archmage Rylan then walked over to Prince Insamal and the pair went walking along the outer edge of the courtyard, discussing other matters. I'll miss you, Shawn, Sarah said, and she gave him a hug and then introduced herself to Laurie, Anthony, and Charles. Leo thanked Shawn very much for what he did and even for going as far as turning himself into a forest saber to see a bad man captured. They all had questions about the paintings that Leo had created in the first place and if the new paintings ever worked. Leo, however, was not allowed to discuss how the paintings truly worked, all on the count that Rylan forbade him not to. It wasn't long until Harmon had come through the courtyard and leaned in close to Charles. It was no surprise that the next moment the spirit of Dale Shepherd also appeared to greet everyone, and to say his final goodbye to a fellow lawman. Charles, if you ever feel the need to come back, just do it, whispered Dale. I won't tell that old man anything. Thanks, Dale, Charles laughed, and he really wanted to shake his hand, but being a ghost and all, knew that a simple thanks was going to have to do. There were some happy tears that had been shed, and yet there was no time like the present to stop prolonging the inevitable. Anthony went through the painting first and followed by Laurie. Shawn and Charles took one last look around the courtyard and they both touched the painting at the same time. They were all home again. Chapter 28. 1 month later. Shawn was in his backyard staring at the lawn that was nearly dead. Their home of Goodyear, Arizona had been in a drought lately and were only able to use the water so many times per week. He shook his head and thought, I can't look at this anymore. Tonight, after it gets dark, I'm going to make my lawn green again. Just then, Laurie had come outside, and she was holding 2 beers in her hand, and she gave one of them to Shawn. Why thank you, my love, Shawn said as he graciously took the cold beer. How's your head these days? She asked as she was scanning the dried-up lawn. I still have a dent, you can feel it right there. Shawn was rubbing his fingers over his hair and was searching for the imperfection where the stone had struck him. Sorry, I guess I can bring you back to life, but I suppose healing bones aren't my specialty. She gave him a joking smile and took a sip of her beer. The lawn looks terrible, babe. I see that. Yeah, I was thinking about fixing that tonight. He answered and gave her a devilish grin. No, Shawn, the neighbors will see, and they will ask questions and if anything, assume that we are using the water at night when we are not supposed to. Laurie was quick to shoot down his idea. No, they won't, I will do it at night, and they won't know the difference. Jake, our neighbor, has a camera on the corner of his house, and it faces this way, so he would have proof that we haven't been watering our lawn. Really? Shawn, I think they'll notice that everyone else's yard looks dead, but overnight, ours is the only one that has turned into a lush oasis. No, you're not touching the grass with your magic. Fun hater, Shawn gave Laurie a grin and she knew he was just playing with her. The two stared into the yard for a moment in silence and then both took a sip of their beer. Laurie was the first to speak again. So, when do you want to go back? You know, I have been thinking about Lufforain a lot this past week, he answered with a sigh. But you heard the old mage, we're not allowed to go back. Yeah, that's true. Laurie looked at Shawn and she could read the expression on his face without him saying anything. Shawn took a long swig of his beer and said, yeah, honestly, I was thinking that the old mage was merely suggesting that we don't go back. Meanwhile in Buffalo, New York, Charles Woods had returned to his home and had a different perspective of his own world, his own life. A simple portrait of his grandfather made from oil paints that he kept hung in his hallway made him rethink the simplicity of it. He reached out and touched it and all he could feel was the dried, uneven surfaces of the paint texture. Charles wondered what his next move should be. Back in Lufforain he was a hero, a lawman who had been believed gone for some time. He now had that power. He felt there was a responsibility to uphold. In truth, since he took a leave away from his work in Buffalo, he didn't want to go back now and retain his detective life. He now had another calling, and it rang very loudly in his ears ever since he stepped through the painting in the Spencer house. It was almost a month since he had been back when he had received an answer to the questions that filled his mind. Lying in bed, Charles was thinking of what laid beyond the Western Kingdom, and surely no matter where he went, his abilities would be welcomed and well paid for. That thought alone gave him comfort. After falling asleep, he dreamed, and within that dream he was standing among the rubble of a ruined castle, with a thick mist surrounding the area. A voice of a man called out to him, and as he turned, he came across someone in a cloak with his hood up covering his face. "It's good to see you again, Charles," the man spoke. At first Charles did not recognize the voice, but the man soon pulled his hood back and revealed the face of a blue-skinned elven prince, known as Ipog or Prince Insamal. "Is this real? How are you able to reach me while I'm on Earth?" asked Charles. Ipog smiled and led him over to a stone bench that had just materialized. They sat down, and for a few moments neither of them said a word. It was Charles who finally broke the silence. "So, are you not going to answer my questions? Charles, do you remember our first meeting?" Clearly Ipog was deflecting his questions. "Of course," Charles answered flatly. "Do you remember when I told you that a lawman would save Lufforain from itself?" Charles said nothing but thought on his words. "I fear there is a lot coming for my world. There are many high-in-power people who think they are owed something. Entitled. These radical ideas will leave us all in chains. Metaphoric or otherwise. I need you, Charles. How do you know that I am the only lawman? There might be one or more hanging out under some rock for all you know." Charles loved his new abilities but hated the fact that the peace of an entire world rested on his shoulders. Ipog laughed and rubbed the side of his face. "I really wish that were true. Then I wouldn't have to put all my eggs into one basket. To be honest, Charles, there is a chance that someone else from your world would come through a Leo Mandarin painting and have the lawman skills. But that is a very high risk and could take centuries to happen. I have you now. Unfortunately, Lufforain cannot wait. The turn has already begun. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in you or that scroll I showed you." Charles stared across to the opposing wall and realized that they were sitting in a hallway, well, what was left of one. The stone beneath their feet was smooth and the wall behind him and across from him arched towards each other. The only thing that was missing was the roof. There was nothing keeping him on Earth, this much was true. He had been looking for a new purpose in life for a while now. The only thing that has stopped him was the fact that the rest of his life he would spend in another world. The unknown and the infinite possibilities that could come from the decision. Yet Ipog didn't seem to be one to let something like this go. He felt that Ipog wasn't giving him a decision at all, but a command that will keep presenting itself until Charles finally agrees. With a sigh and feeling it was hopeless to argue the matter any further, Charles turned to Ipog and said, "Tell me what I have to do." This book is dedicated to the loving memory of Dale Shepherd, or more commonly known by his family as Pops. You are forever in our hearts.